This is my true story. I buried my wife Elena 15 years ago after a sudden illness took her from me. But yesterday I was walking through the downtown park and saw something impossible. There, walking on the footpath, was my wife, not a ghost, but flesh and blood, holding hands with my best friend, Mark. She was wearing the same blue dress she wore on our last anniversary. I froze in terror and confusion. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and silence. When I unlocked my front door, the air inside felt stale. For 15 years, this house had been a shrine. I walked across the floorboards quietly, as if I were a thief in my own life. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow. The furniture, the curtains, the framed photos, they weren't memories. They were props in a museum of lies. I stopped at the mantel. The ceramic urn sat there, cool and pale in the dim light. I had spoken to this jar every night since the funeral. I had told it about my day, about the ache in my back, about how much I missed her. I reached out. My hands were trembling, vibrating with a rage I hadn't let myself feel yet. The urn felt heavier than I remembered. Or maybe the burden of it had just changed. It didn't feel like a grounding anchor anymore. It felt like a mockery. I carried it to the garage. The air out there smelled of oil and cold concrete. I flipped the switch, and the overhead fluorescent light flickered on with a sick, buzzing hum. It was a harsh light, unforgiving. I spread out a newspaper on the workbench. The headlines were meaningless black ink. I took a breath that rattled in my chest, and I tipped the urn. The contents poured out in a soft, gray rush. A mound of dust settled on the paper. I stared at it. It didn't look right. It was too uniform, too gritty. I reached out and touched it. It wasn't the soft, bone-dry powder of human remains. It was coarse. I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger. It smeared like charcoal, wood ash, mixed with playground sand to give it weight. I had been mourning a fireplace. I sifted through the pile, my movements frantic now, pushing aside the gray lies. Then, my fingernail clicked against something hard. I pulled it out. It wasn't bone. It was flat, rigid, and melted at the edges. I wiped the soot away with my thumb. A small, charred triangle of plastic. A piece of a credit card. I stared at the jagged edge, the silence of the garage ringing in my ears. She hadn't just left me. She had swept up the trash from a fire pit and handed it to me to worship. The tape screamed as I peeled it back, a harsh, tearing sound that cut through the silence of the attic. I sat cross-legged on the rough insulation, surrounded by cardboard skeletons. It was 3 a.m. Sleep was a country I couldn't visit anymore. The single bulb overhead swayed slightly, casting long, nervous shadows that stretched across the rafters. I wasn't looking for memories. I was looking for the mechanics of a lie. 15 years ago, I had lived in a fog. The days after her death were a blur of Valium and heavy curtains. I remembered Mark standing in my kitchen, making coffee, fielding phone calls. He had been the rock, the sturdy brother-in-law. "I'll handle the paperwork," he had said, his hand on my shoulder. "You just rest." And I had rested. I had let him navigate the bureaucracy of death while I drowned in it. Now, the darkness of the attic felt like the inside of my own skull, cluttered, dusty, and full of things I had ignored for too long. I found the box labeled 2010. My hands were filthy with dust as I clawed through tax returns and old bills. Then I saw it. A manila envelope, crisp and official. Cremation certificate. I pulled it out. The paper felt thin, cheap. I scanned the typed lines until I reached the bottom. The signature was scrawled in confident, heavy black ink. Dr. Elias Vance. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that name. I closed my eyes and saw him. Mark's old roommate from medical school. The one who hadn't practiced medicine in a decade. The one who lost his license for selling prescriptions. This wasn't a medical document. It was a favor. The betrayal expanded in my chest, cold and geometric. It wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a mistake. It was a conspiracy. Mark hadn't just comforted the grieving widower. He had manufactured him. Outside, the sky began to bruise with the first gray light of dawn. A single beam of sunlight pierced the dusty window, illuminating the motes floating in the stagnant air, millions of tiny fractured truths dancing in the light. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. I stood up, my knees cracking. I looked at the mess I had made. The man who climbed up here, the broken, weeping husband, was gone. He stayed in the dark. I walked toward the trapdoor. To catch them, I couldn't be a victim anymore. I had to be a ghost in their machine. The engine ticked as it cooled. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the address scrolled on the back of a gas station receipt. 14 Maple Drive. It was only 2 towns over, 20 minutes on the highway. But it felt like I had driven to the edge of the world. I didn't park in front. I couldn't. I left the car 3 streets away, tucked behind a line of manicured hedges. I walked. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. It was a Tuesday morning. The neighborhood was waking up. A school bus groaned in the distance. A dog barked, sharp and rhythmic. My boots crunched loudly on the fallen autumn leaves. I tried to step lightly, but I felt heavy. I felt like a stain on a perfect white tablecloth. I stopped behind the rough bark of a large oak tree. There it was. Number 14. It was a craftsman bungalow, deep blue siding, white pillars, a porch big enough for 2 rocking chairs. My chest tightened until I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a house. It was the house. The one she used to circle in the Sunday real estate section. The one she'd pinned to our refrigerator with a magnet, sighing that we'd never be able to afford the down payment. But there it was. Real. Solid. The garden was perfect. Hydrangeas, perfectly pruned, bowing their heavy heads. A wind chime spun slowly on the porch, sending out delicate, tinkling notes that sounded like laughter. The banality of it broke me. There was a newspaper rolled up on the mat. A milk bottle by the door. It was a life of aggressive normalcy. She hadn't run away to be a fugitive. She had run away to be a housewife. The front door clicked. I pressed myself against the oak, my fingernails digging into the bark. The door swung open, and she stepped out. She was wearing a thick white bathrobe. Her hair was loose, catching the morning sun. She bent down to pick up the paper, her movement fluid and easy. She didn't look older. She didn't look haunted. She looked rested. As she straightened up, the sound drifted across the lawn. A soft, melodic hum. I closed my eyes. It was Yellow Submarine. The song she used to hum while she did the dishes. The song I thought had died in the fire with her. She turned and went back inside, shutting the door on the world and taking the music with her. The passenger seat was a graveyard of paper cups, 3 days of cold coffee, stale donuts, and silence. My car had become a capsule, floating on the edge of their universe, smelling of old leather and exhaustion. I hadn't shaved. The stubble on my chin scraped against my palm as I waited. I wasn't living anymore. I was just watching the house breathe. I learned the rhythm of the life they had stolen. At 8:00 a.m., Mark's silver sedan backed out of the driveway. He checked his mirrors, not for traffic, but for habit. Always cautious, always the responsible one, the traitor in a suit and tie. At 10 a.m., Elena came out. She moved through the garden with a watering can, touching the heavy heads of the hydrangeas like they were children. She looked peaceful. That was the knife that twisted deepest in my gut. Her peace. At 7:00 p.m., the kitchen lights glowed warm and yellow. They left the curtains open, a lit stage for an audience of one. I watched them pass the bread. I saw Mark pour. Her wine. I witnessed the intimacy of 15 years of dinners I never got to eat. It was a slow, quiet torture. Seeing my best friend living inside my marriage. Rain began to drizzle on the windshield, blurring the warm light of their window. Scritch, scritch. The wipers moved, but they couldn't clear the image from my mind. The sadness in my chest began to change. It stopped being a heavy, drowning weight. It started to burn. It calcified into something hard, cold and geometric. Rage. I stared at my hands on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Why? Was I that broken? Was I so terrible to love that she had to die to get away from me? Or was this just pure, unadulterated selfishness? Night 3. The rain had stopped. The streetlights buzzed overhead. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted. Elena was on the sofa, reading. But Mark was standing up. He was pacing. He walked a tight circle on the Persian rug. He stopped at the window, peering out into the blackness. He couldn't see me. I was just a shadow 3 streets away. But he felt me. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up his face in a ghostly blue. He checked it, shoved it back in, then took it out again. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous tic I hadn't seen since our finals in med school. He was agitated. The silence from the bistro call was eating him alive. I leaned back in the darkness, watching his silhouette twitch in the window. He knew the ghost was waking up. His paranoia was the first weapon I had held in years. The hallway smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and decay. A television blared somewhere down the corridor, canned laughter echoing off the peeling linoleum walls. I found room 304. The door was ajar, like a mouth that couldn't quite close. Inside, the blinds were drawn against the afternoon sun, slicing the room into strips of dust and shadow. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of an oxygen tank. Dr. Eris was smaller than I remembered. He was just a pile of blankets now. His hands, once steady enough to sign a life away, twitched on the stained sheets. I pulled a metal chair close to the bed. It scraped the floor, a harsh, violent sound in the stillness. His eyes snapped open. They were cloudy, drifting through years I wasn't part of. "Elias," I said softly. He blinked, struggling to focus. "Do you remember Mark?" The name acted like a stimulant. His gaze sharpened, locking onto my face with sudden, lucid terror. He tried to shift away, but the bed rails held him. The fear in his eyes was ancient. I leaned in, the smell of antiseptic thick in my throat. "Why did you sign the certificate? There was no illness. We both know that." He began to weep. A dry, rattling sound. "The horses," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I owed too much." He confessed in broken fragments, debts that had turned into broken fingers. Mark had appeared like a savior with a checkbook and a pen. A simple trade, a signature for a life. "She was already leaving," he wheezed. "I just papered over the exit." The truth settled in my gut like wet cement. There was no tragedy, no cancer. My grief was just the receipt for a gambling debt. She wasn't taken by God. She was purchased. I stood up. The air in the room felt poisonous. I needed to leave. I turned toward the door, my hand reaching for the frame. Suddenly his hand shot out, bony, cold, and surprisingly strong. He grabbed my wrist, his nails digging into my skin. He pulled me down, his eyes wide and desperate, needing to unburden his soul before the dark took him. "There was another reason," he hissed, his breath smelling of iron. "She wasn't sick. She was pregnant. That's why they had to run." The rain beat against the metal roof of the car like 1,000 nervous fingers tapping for attention. I sat in the nursing home parking lot, the engine cold, the heater off. My breath fogged the glass, turning the world outside into a gray smear. She was pregnant. The words hung in the damp air, heavier than the silence. They didn't just change the story. They broke the spine of my past. I closed my eyes and forced myself to go back. 15 years ago. I did the math in the dark. I remembered the sudden migraines, the nausea she blamed on the flu, the way she started sleeping in the guest room, locking the door because she needed the quiet. I had stood outside that door with a tray of soup, thinking I was being a supportive husband to a dying woman. I wasn't. I was just the obstacle. She wasn't dying. She was growing. I started the car. My hands were steady now. The trembling was gone. I drove back to the house on Willow Street. The tires hissed on the wet asphalt. A long, wet tear through the night. The child would be 14 now. Maybe 15. I parked under the dripping oak tree. The house was a dark silhouette against the bruised sky. I scanned the yard for a sign. A bicycle leaning against the porch? A basketball hoop in the driveway? Nothing. Just the pristine, empty lawn. I stared at the black windows. The betrayal wasn't about love. It wasn't about sex. It was about biology. They hadn't just run away. They had erased me to build a fortress around a secret. For 15 years, I had mourned a tragedy. But there was no tragedy here. Only a theft. The grief that had defined me for a decade finally evaporated. It didn't leave a void. It left a clear, cold space. A space for reckoning. My phone buzzed against the center console. A harsh mechanical sound. The screen lit up, washing the car interior in a sickly blue light. I looked down. Mark. I read the text, the letters sharp and bright. "I know you're watching. We need to talk." I didn't reply. I just looked at the house one last time. The ghosts were done hiding. The blue light of the phone pulsed on the passenger seat, a digital heartbeat I refused to acknowledge. I let it vibrate against the leather, a frantic, insect-like buzzing that filled the silent car. I didn't touch it. I didn't look at it. I just drove. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked different. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a stage. And I had a set to build. I walked inside and turned on every light. The glare was blinding, exposing the dust of a year spent staring at the wall. I began to clean. I didn't scrub with the frantic energy of panic. I moved with the slow, deliberate precision of a surgeon. I cleared the piles of unread mail from the counter. I washed the stale coffee cups. I swept the floor. I was erasing the man they thought I was, the broken, depressive widower. I was making room for something else. I went to the linen closet and pulled out the white tablecloth, the one with the lace edges, the one we had used for our 10th anniversary, spread it over the dining table, smoothing out the creases with the flat of my hand. I set 3 places, one for me at the head, one for Mark to my right, one for Elena to my left. Silverware, napkins, wine glasses, perfect alignment. Then, I went to the garage. I picked up the urn. It was heavy now, filled with the damp black soil from the garden, the only honest thing in this house. I carried it into the dining room and placed it in the exact center of the table, a silent, ceramic centerpiece, a gravity well for the lies they were about to bring. It was 2 a.m. when I finally picked up my phone. Mark's text was still there, desperate and glowing. I typed slowly. My thumbs didn't shake. "Dinner? Tomorrow? 7 p.m. Bring her." I hit send. I watched the delivery receipt appear. I felt the shift in the air. For 15 years, I had been the one waiting for answers. Now, silence was my weapon. Their fear was the only leverage I had left. I didn't go to bed. I pulled the heavy armchair from the corner and positioned it facing the front door. I sat in the dark, my hands resting on the armrests, watching the dust motes swirl in the gloom. I wondered what they would bring through that door when the sun went down. Would they bring a gun? Or would they finally bring the truth? 7 o'clock arrived not with a sound, but with a flash of light. I was standing in the hallway when the headlights swept across the living room wall. 2 bright white beams slicing through the dark, illuminating the dust I hadn't managed to clean. They paused in the driveway, holding the house in a blinding interrogation. The car door slammed. Then another. I didn't rush. I walked to the door with the slow, heavy gait of a man walking underwater. The doorbell rang, a cheerful two-tone chime that sounded grotesque in the silence. I unlocked the deadbolt. Click. I pulled the door open. The air seemed to rush out of the house, leaving a vacuum where my lungs used to be. Elena. She was standing on the porch under the yellow buzz of the outdoor light. She was real. She was wearing a gray coat I had never seen, her hair cut short in a style I didn't know. Seeing her alive didn't feel like relief. It felt like an amputation. The grief I had nursed for 15 years was suddenly severed, leaving only a phantom pain. She couldn't look at me. Her eyes were glued to the floorboards, studying the grain of the wood as if it were a map to an exit. Mark stood in front of her. His body was tense, shoulders squared in a posture of defense, but his face betrayed him. His eyes were wide, pleading, darting between me and the dark street. He looked like a man who had been running for a long time and had finally hit a wall. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stepped aside. The gesture was polite, almost domestic. "Come in," I didn't say. I just breathed it. They walked past me, bringing the smell of rain and cold air into the warmth of the house. The floorboards creaked under their weight, groaning at the intrusion. We walked to the dining room. I sat at the head of the table. Mark took the right. Elena took the left. We were a family again, arranged in a mockery of 1,000 dinners past. But in the center, sitting on the lace tablecloth, was the urn. It sat there, like a judge, dark and silent. Mark cleared his throat. The sound was rough, scratching against the tension. He opened his mouth, ready to explain, ready to spin the first thread of a new lie. I raised my hand. He stopped, his mouth snapping shut. I didn't look at him. I looked at the woman who had promised to love me until death. I pointed a trembling finger at the jar of dirt between us. "Tell me who was in there, Elena." The truth didn't come out like a roar. It spilled out like a broken glass of water, messy, spreading, and impossible to put back. Elena sat with her hands clasped on the table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. She didn't cry. She just whispered. I sat back in my chair, listening to the destruction of my life being explained away as a kindness. It wasn't a grand conspiracy. It wasn't hatred. It was cowardice. She spoke of the church, of her parents' judgmental stares, of the suffocating weight of being a divorced woman in a town that whispered. She fell. In love with Mark, she said, but she couldn't bear the shame of leaving me, so they chose a different kind of leaving. "We didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought, if I died, you could move on with a clean heart." I stared at the urn. A clean heart. It was a twisted, sickly logic. They had murdered my soul to save their reputations. They had staged a tragedy because they were too weak to stage a breakup. Then came the child. She looked up for the first time, her eyes wet. "She's 15. Her name is Sarah." I felt a cold phantom pass through me. Mark's daughter, the reason for the rush, the reason for the fake ashes. "She asks about you," Mark added quietly, his voice rough. We told her her mother's first husband was a good man, that he died a hero." I didn't blink. I watched Elena. For years, I had built a cathedral in my mind for this woman. I had worshipped her memory. But sitting there, under the harsh dining room light, the cathedral collapsed. She wasn't a goddess. She was just a coward who let me mourn alive for 15 years so she wouldn't have to face her mother. The silence returned, heavier than before. I leaned forward. The wood of the table felt cold under my forearms. I looked at Mark, then at Elena. I had one card left to play, one thread to pull that would unravel the beautiful tapestry they had woven for their daughter. "Does she know?" I asked softly. Does your daughter know that her father was the best man at her mother's first wedding?" I didn't raise my voice. The house was waiting for a scream, for the breaking of glass, but I gave it a whisper. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope. It was thin, unassuming. I placed it on the lace tablecloth and put 2 fingers on the paper. I slid it across the wood. The sound was soft, like dry leaves skittering over pavement. But in the silence of the dining room, it roared. It stopped right between the wine glasses, next to the urn. Mark looked down. He didn't need to open it. He recognized the letterhead. He recognized Dr. Aris's shaky signature. Elena went pale. Her hands started to tremble, vibrating against the edge of the table. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't fearful anymore. It was pathetic. They weren't the villains of a grand, romantic tragedy. They were just 2 people who had built a castle on a foundation of sand, and I had just kicked the bottom out. "I'm not calling the police," I said. The relief on their faces was instantaneous, almost insulting. Mark let out a breath he had been holding since he walked in. "And I'm not suing you," I added. I took a sip of water. It tasted cold, clean. "Because that's too easy. Police reports get filed away. Lawsuits settle." I leaned forward, catching Mark's gaze and holding it. "I want something worse. I want you to go home. I want you to kiss your daughter goodnight. And I want you to look at her every single day and know that I am out here, holding the match that could burn her entire reality to the ground." I stood up. The chair scraped against the chair floor. A sharp, final sound. I walked to the front door and threw it open. The night air rushed in, smelling of rain and wet asphalt. It felt biting and cleansing. They stood up, gathering their coats like armor that had failed them. They walked past me without a word. They looked smaller, hunched. They weren't the golden couple laughing in the bistro anymore. They were fugitives in their own lives, condemned to look over their shoulders forever. I closed the door. Click. I locked the deadbolt. Thud. I walked back to the dining room. The urn was still there, the centerpiece of the lie. I picked it up. It felt light now, meaningless. I walked to the kitchen and dropped it into the trash can. A dull, hollow thud. No ceremony, no tears, just garbage. I poured a glass of wine, sat in silence, and closed my eyes. Finally, the house began to breathe again.